As a counselor, it happens quite often that terms of this field sort of escape contagion. They get out and they mingle around in the general population. And I think that's pretty normal, I guess. It's common, at least. There's a lot of people receiving counseling services. They run into these terms and they want to use them. And a lot of times it doesn't necessarily bother me. If everyone wants to walk around calling everything projection without really knowing how that works, I just kind of move past that. It's not the biggest problem. But one I've seen lately that I think a misconception is actually turning into quite a problem in the general public is around the concept of boundaries. So I wanted to make a very short video. This will be very quick, so listen up. Just to talk about boundaries, about how they work, what they are, and how our current conception or how this commonly held conception out in the world might be kind of skewing our view of this concept of boundaries. So let's get into it. First, let's just define what boundaries are not. They are not laws, they're not rules necessarily, and they're certainly not hexes or spells. If if you say, all right, my boundary is you cannot touch me unless I've given you permission to, that doesn't suddenly conjure a force field around your physical person that stops anyone from touching you. That's ridiculous. It's just not how boundaries work. But I see that quite a lot. People are like, I've told you my boundary is you cannot talk to me after 9 p.m. And it's like, you can't just force control over other people's actions like that. And that's not how a boundary was meant to work. And it's not how they work, at least in this concept of boundaries that you're often going to hear from your counselor or therapist of some sort. So if boundaries aren't spells, if they aren't a means of controlling someone else's behavior, which they truly are not, then what are they? Well, boundaries are if-then statements. And that's kind of basically the function of them. They are if-then statements that you then carry out. So another important thing about boundaries is that they really don't rely on anyone else, and they shouldn't involve anyone else's actions to implement. So boundaries are fully on you to deliver and uphold your own boundaries. So no one else can violate your boundaries. That's a really important thing. I hear this a lot. Well, he violated my boundaries. She violated this boundary. That's not how that works. Only you can violate your boundary. So let's give an example. If your boundary, let's say if you want someone to stop talking to you in a very specific tone, or if you want them to stop engaging with you when they're very angry, you don't really get to say, you can't talk to me when you're angry. What you can say, though, is, if you speak to me in this tone, I will be leaving the discussion. That's it. That's the if-then. If you decide to treat me this way, then I will not take it and I will leave. I will walk out. I will end the conversation. I will move on. Or similarly, I will engage with this conversation if I am being spoken to fairly. That's another flip of the same contingency of how a boundary would work. Outlining what you're willing to tolerate and what you are not. That is a boundary. So you can't say, you can't talk to me like that. Clearly they can. They're doing it right now. And your words didn't just force some sort of extra normal experience where their tongue became tied and they can't talk to you anymore. It just doesn't work like that. That would be quite powerful, but not really fair, and that's not how this works anyway. So you can only control your own actions. That's what a lot of counseling is about, learning what you can control, what you can't control, and how to kind of define that difference and then make changes where you can. And really often what you can control is yourself. That's really the most of what you can control in many given situations. So a boundary is not a leverage of control over someone else. It is really just you saying, here's what I will tolerate in any given situation, and here's what I won't. And importantly, following through on that. If a boundary gets broken, if a boundary gets violated, that kind of is a you problem. I know that's kind of a harsh way to put it, but it's fundamentally that's true. A boundary is you saying, if this happens, I will do this. It's not saying you can't do this, because you can't control someone else like that. And so you can set your boundaries and should set your boundaries clearly. You should communicate them to people. That's important too, because if we're always bumping into other people's boundaries without necessarily knowing about it, that's going to cause them a lot of distress. But fundamentally, again, that was up to them to communicate. So if you are finding yourself bumping into boundaries a lot, it's likely that you're not communicating them fairly. Or if you are communicating them and you're still running into this problem, maybe you're not enforcing your boundaries firmly enough. Maybe people don't take you seriously, and so they are constantly pushing that boundary with you because you're not enforcing your own limitations. So one last time, boundaries are not a means of controlling someone else. They are if-then statements based on your behavior and your actions that you have to carry out and maintain. So if you find yourself constantly feeling like your boundaries are being violated, that's a time to look in the mirror because only you can violate your boundaries. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, and I'll be back with another video soon.